blank screen receptivity to actually, for the person to feel met and welcomed, and you're really delighted to see them.
I like that. I like the idea of delight, the psychotherapy of delight. Welcome to the Wild Psychotherapists Listening in Space. In this podcast, John and I talk about the different qualities of listening, being present, and creating space for a client in psychotherapy. The discussion wanders around mother-child relationships, stuckness, and the importance of wonder and delight in psychotherapy. If you enjoy these podcasts, please like us, subscribe, and most importantly, leave a comment, question, or suggestion. We'd love to have you involved. Thank you. So what was that question you were asking?
Well, it's always a bit of a mystery, and maybe an ever-changing mystery of how do we listen? What's our own internal process of attending to clients, of listening, and what are the kind of internal reference points that is like a searching process to better understand or better appreciate, or to create a kind of alignment or an attunement with the client that feels like it might be helpful or developmental or transformative in some way, or just reassuring that they're not alone in this. So that theme for me is always, well, I don't think we often articulate, try to articulate how do we do that? What goes on inside?
Well, I was doing this teaching with the Zambians on listening. And then it was like, I can't really teach what I do. I can't articulate a lot of the times what I do because it's become so automatic and rather spontaneous. But it does bring up a question in my mind, which is when we're listening, what are we listening to? Because there's the story. There's a story that people tell us. And particularly in the beginning, you really get engaged with the story. And some people are very engaging and they take you off on a little track with their story. But then you don't want to listen to what they say. I've often said this to the more advanced therapists. Don't listen to what your client says. Listen to what they mean. And how do we pick up the meaning of what people say? How do we listen for that? And as you say, there's that, and I remember this much more clearly when I was, younger. The decision to respond. How do we do that? When a person says all of this information, which part of it do we respond to? And how do we make that internal decision that bit is more relevant and that bit is, I need to let it slide? Or that bit is very relevant, but I can't say anything about it yet because it's not ready.
I like that, what you've just said. And it stimulates in my mind an appreciation that people are also trying to get, that unconsciously or consciously, but I think a lot of it's unconscious. There's something that wants to be understood, that wants to get through to me, and wants to be able to decode in amongst it all in their story. What's the historical anguish or suffering that's happened that they're trying to unravel, or they're acting out in a way that is continually sabotaging the possibility of better relationships or a better self-image?
How do you think of that? Because I just have some very simple models, which is it's either stuck or it's not stuck. So that anything that moves is alive and anything that doesn't move is dead. That's my simple model. And that goes for everything.
What do you mean by moves?
Aliveness is motion, is change, is development, is shifting and reforming. It's even dying and rebirth, but there's some movement to it. But what you see with clients is that they're recycling. they're recycling the same old stuff and it's going round and round and it's dead. It's dead in the way that a tree is dead when it stops growing or stops producing, leaves and all the rest of it. And I came to this uh, understanding for myself, which is I can't tolerate stuckness. I can't tolerate that in my client. I know that sounds strange. So when a person is doing the same thing more than twice, it's like it irritates something inside me. And it's almost like I'm kind of bound to do something to try and change that. Now, there has to be some restraint, of course, but that's kind of the simple model that I have of therapy, which is it's stuck or it's not stuck. It's growing or it's not growing.
I think probably it could be nuanced a lot more than stuck or unstuck.
It can be, but it's easy for me to actually feel when something's stuck.
Mm.
It's an uncomfortable feeling.
Hmm. Well, I certainly feel that with some clients in a very profound way.
Hmm.
And sharing with them, even I don't necessarily understand what their stuckness is about, but I, I to hear it and to name it and to say how much I appreciate the kind of suffering that goes on
Mm.
in that stuckness. And and I want to hear more. I want to try to understand better. And and some of that is feels like being a parent who's concerned about a child who is uh, stuck and miserable and has kind of withdrawn from the world in a way, and they're self-soothing
Hmm.
or they're avoiding things in life, and they need a kind of auxiliary, well, you could say auxiliary ego. The term often is used. People need an auxiliary ego in order to kind of process things in a less alone way so that there are possibilities that can come out of the relationship that they can't get to within themselves. And
So
so,
that's kind of the same thing, which is and that goes back to the listening. If you just listen to the story is something the person's told themselves. It's a fabrication about why things have to be a certain way a lot of times.
mm,
I'm thinking particularly of some clients, which is that they will tell you the story, and sometimes it's not that it's not got value, the story, but it's like, this is the story of my life, and therefore, this is how I have to be. And to me,
mm,
that's got a kind of like a stuckness to it. And so then you have to listen sometimes to what's not said, what
mm,
isn't being said, what's missing, what has kind of got um, avoided or whatever, we can talk about it in like, these are defensive structures, but there's a piece missing or there's pieces missing. And that as I listen to it, because the person speaks, they hear themselves. And that, I mean, we've all had that experience in therapy, which is you're speaking and sometimes you're saying things that you think you understand, but you don't understand them until you hear yourself say them.
I mean, there's a parallel there with what goes on between mothers and babies, either towards growth and development or towards a kind of survival strategy and a sense of mundane existence where the parenting isn't really developmental parenting. It's more about managing the fact that they've got a child and they don't have a sense of the agency of the child being valuable enough that there's a projection that's very limited. And so there's a kind of going around in vicious circles, where things start quite often in that kind of territory. I was reading an interesting paper this past week, and it was about research of traditional psychotherapy, mother-baby psychotherapy, which was often just trying to help the mother understand something better and do it differently,
Mm.
and maybe trying to facilitate that through kind of maybe coaching or support. And the other was called Watch, Wait, and Wonder. And all they did was instruct the mother to get on the floor with the child.
That's very nice. I'm going to write that down.
I'll send you the paper if you like.
Oh,
It's
yes, I'd like to see that.
okay. Well, it's actually wonderful. I mean, it captures things. They say it's a new type of psychotherapy, mother-baby psychotherapy, but it's based on some very old ideas, Winnicott,
Yeah, I was
you know.
just thinking it sounds just like Winnicott.
But but they tell the mother not to take any initiative, but to follow and respond to the initiative of the child, and to meet them in that in a joyous wonder kind of way. And that the child will kind of then start to kind of something will kind of be stimulated and it will mount. It become more relational, more turn taking comes into it.
Right.
But it becomes because the mother is instructed not to take over and not to take up too much space, but just keep following the child's initiative and believing that what's going on in that play and that there's a rich expansion of the child's consciousness going on through their creative novelty because they're given the space to be creative and to be enjoying their own novelty. And it's fascinating, but they found that the results of that in terms of the relationship between mother and baby and the attachment, it was very much more than the traditional model.
Hmm. So, is there a book called Boundary and Space? I thought that was a Winnicott. But I thought there's a lot of stuff on in Winnicott about creating that space
Hmm.
for the baby to move into, and that the mother not taking up all the space in the relationship. But of course, then if there's too much space in the relationship, then the child is abandoned.
Hmm. Hmm.
So there has to be a certain quality of attention during the waiting period. There has to be a presence. Because if the baby doesn't feel the presence of the mother, then they can't relax and just kind of move into that space.
Hmm. I think that's where the wonder comes in. You know,
Mm,
the kind of appreciation of the wonderment the child's in as a kind of field of their own you know, their own omnipotence. You could say that they don't have words for such a thing, but they're alive. And you talked about movement. I think Daniel Stern's last book was called Forms of Vitality, and it was all about movement. You know,
mm.
very similar to what you were describing. And in that, yeah, it's led me to kind of think, what are the most subtle forms of that?
Okay,
And
say a bit more about the subtle forms because I know you're really into subtlety, John.
well, say in attending to a client, and um, you could say it relates to what you called presence, that the subtle forms of availability, of sensitivity, of receptivity, of resonance, of welcoming, of hospitableness, of delightfulness. Yeah, that there are so many subtle forms of presence within presence that the client, when they come into that kind of environment, something like with the mother and the baby, she's present in an alive and vital way.
Right.
And we're alive in a vital and receptive way. And we're delighted, on the whole, to see clients. Yeah. And and
So
when that
that's
kind
a
of
lovely
thing
part,
starts,
actually. Sorry, I didn't mean
but
to interrupt. It's just that's a piece I think that is very seldom talked about enjoyment and delight from the therapist to the client, the kind of welcoming into a space which is well, which is welcoming, which is if no, I suppose you'd call it loving, which is like
mm, mm,
you are an important person, and I'm
mm.
pleased to see you.
Yeah, I think that's a lovely thing to rather than a kind of more blank screen receptivity, to actually for the person to feel met and welcomed, and you're really delighted to see them.
I like that. I like the idea of delight, the psychotherapy of delight.
Mhm. Yeah, that's like it's
Sorry, so I did cut you off as usual.
no, 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 no. You didn't. Well, yes, you did, but it wasn't bad. It wasn't a bad one. But to relate that to say being interested in the client, like with mother baby, and then the client starts. So they might go through their whole story, many stories. They might need to tell those stories. And
Yeah.
I think it'll come back to me in a minute, but he talks about um, how everyone's looking for a relational home that maybe they've never had. And so the stories is like, uh, is it here? Is it here? Is it here? There's a kind of hopeful expectancy within the story of how they want to be met and enjoyed and understood and to feel the flow of your empathic responsiveness to them. And that if you don't take over, is then going to kind of ignite a you could say a bubbling springs within the client of of emancipation, the beginning of emancipation and the beginning of more insightful awareness and a wider perspective and reflective awareness and a deeper capacity to kind of enjoy the fact that they're using their spontaneity. It's coming not just as a problem-solving, tale-telling phenomena, but it's coming from a different source within them, maybe from the live wood as opposed to the dead wood.
Okay, so I had a lot of thoughts as you were talking. I was thinking about my mother, of course, because you have to go back to thinking like, okay, so how was my mother in relation to me? Would she have created that space? And the answer is absolutely not. She just didn't have the capacity to do that. She would be either withdrawing from me and my brothers and sisters, or she would be doing something to me which required being done. Change the nappy, feed the baby, move them from X to Y. But there's no space in that. And then the opposite of that would be withdrawal. So too much space. And as you were talking, I was thinking, okay, so we have to learn how to do that, to create that space with our clients, particularly if it's not natural to us. If we
Hmm.
haven't actually had that when we've
You poor little guy.
hmm?
You poor little guy.
I could tell
That,
you I can tell you my first memory from the age of probably less than two. Not great. But
and we laugh, but because
it's
we could,
because
we could cry, we could
it's
cry.
good try, but it's because when you get to this point in your life, it is me, but it's not me. That happened to that other poor little guy. I
Mm,
don't feel the pain of that anymore. It's it's washed away, if you like.
mm,
But I look at it and I think, oh, okay, so that was something. And then I'd start to think about, so maybe I had to have that experience. I don't want to minimize it because then I can understand what it's like for my clients. I
mm,
can understand it. And then I have to know that I have to create a different kind of space.
mm,
Um, and then I was thinking about that in relation to stuckness, which is that if the mother has always basically been doing stuff to you, it's blocked your ability to be
mm,
creative, blocked
mm,
your ability to see and experience things in a different way. And so that's part of how it creates the stuckness. And
mm.
then you open up the space. And I'm thinking of some clients who will just move into that space, but some clients will go like, "Oh my God, this is terrifying." I
Mm,
much prefer this very small,
mm,
little place which I know where I am because
mm.
you're creating too much space here for me.
And so what do you do about that?
That's a good question. And I think I've said this before, I have no idea. It
Mm,
has to happen in the moment. And we talk about process in psychotherapy. I think
mm,
process is that sense in which the next thing that happens because the previous thing happened. And there's a process which unfolds. It's an
mm,
unfolding. And you won't know how it's going to unfold until you're there.
mm,
And your work is very process oriented, isn't it?
mm. Well, I was thinking in relation to your mother and what happened to
Oh, I
you.
see. Right.
The in terms of process, and you saying um, washed away. You used the words washed away, and I would say it's been washed. It's been revitalized and washed by being washed with awareness with the work you've done. And so there's something there that then, you could say comes back to life, or new shoots start growing just at the join between the dead wood and the live wood. And there's a kind of flourishing that goes on that is like continued growth as opposed to a shrinking of the vitality of the tree. So you've washed the kind of, it's not cauterized where no growth can happen, and there's a retreat of life and vitality back into the tree, the roots survival for a bit longer. You've purified or washed or changed that dynamic through
Well,
the work you.
that's part of what happens, isn't it, in therapy, which is every experience we have
Mm,
is its meaning is dependent on the context we put it into. And when a person gets stuck, the context stays the same, so the meaning stays the same. And then when you change or expand the context in psychotherapy, the
mm,
meaning of the experience changes. And therefore
mm,
the experience is different. I'm always really curious about my experiences when I was a child. And I know that at the time they were really painful and disturbing, and I was pretty screwed. But I look back now and I like them. I enjoy them. I find them fascinating. I'm very curious about what does it mean to be a human being in this body,
mm,
having had those experiences, and why those experiences? What were they for? That's a question I always ask myself. What is this experience for? Why would I have that experience? And what does it do for me rather
mm.
than do against me, if you like?
And it's that there's something going on, as Winifred said, something's always happening.
Yeah,
Something's
yeah,
happening.
it's always happening. Yes.
But what you said made me think of Lawrence Kuby, who was a New York psychoanalyst, and his whole thing was creativity. But he had a lovely model. There was a paper he put into one of the early child psychotherapy, child psychoanalysis magazines or books that was really fascinating. He said that um, when that when that stuckness happens, the individual becomes locked into a space between one end, there's something that's strictly determined that keeps happening. And at the other end, there's a fear of going outside comfort zones.
Right.
So that zone becomes, well, he said it becomes sterile, but I think it's not so much sterile as it's going around within a limited territory in vicious cycles, maybe self-sabotaging or just reprocessing the same stuckness. But there's a clanging, on the boundary of the world through either acting out or acting in. There's a kind of clanging that goes on between the inner world and the outer world, which people may or may not see. I used to feel when I'd go into schools, there were so many deadpan children. They were totally deadpan. That you could say there's a dead wood there. There's a
Right.
lot of dead wood.
Well, I mean, weren't you deadpan when you were in school? It's like
Yeah.
I used to think to myself, what the hell are they trying to teach me? This makes no sense at all. This is no use to me. I mean, that's why I left at 15, you know. It was like, I can't cope with this because it's a waste of time. It's a waste of my life. What use is this for my life? Um, I could be doing all sorts of other things. And, talk about the way in which society requires you to be dead. It's actually working hard to deaden people because, of course, then it wants dead people working in dead-end jobs, not thinking about what they're doing, not thinking about the effect of what they're doing, and then not thinking of what the alternatives might be.
If children are able to protest, I mean, the ones that do get kind of crushed a lot
Yeah.
of the time. But but if we listened to and welcomed children's protests, then and we saw them as opportunities to really think about how can we do this better? How can we educate? What systems can we create instead of these really mass situations where children are in some ways cruelly put together with a lot of other very poor souls without enough adults around, and there's a kind of it's almost like a preparation for war, for more war. It's that when children get a kind of impeccable experience of responsiveness and attending and creativity and stimulation, that they're even if they've had bad, or unpleasant or traumatic prior experiences, they're still looking. They're looking for that relational home where there's a creative possibility for them to get back on track in life. And so, well, that Peter Norris and also Slabson said that there is a kind of that doesn't go, un doesn't get lost within the psyche, that there's a realignment. Slabson said that there was a realignment, that you set again a hope in place that there's more people like this in the world, there are more opportunities. You want to be more like that yourself. And it's a lot of it's an unconscious process, but there's a reawakening of one's, you could say, true central headquarters.
Right. And that's exactly what I was thinking, which is it's not as though you're actually um, reprogramming, which is
Mm,
often how some people think of it. No, it's education in the true sense, which is that you're inviting something that's already there, which is fundamental in us as human beings. And I always think about this in terms of babies, that babies are born with this incredible optimism. If you think about it, they assume that their mother is going to respond to them. It's built in, and Jung would say this is the archetype. The
mm,
child has the archetype fully formed and projects that on the mother, and
mm,
the archetype is perfect. This is the perfect, nurturing, responsive person. And that is exactly what I require. And of course, the mother can't be the archetype because she's going to fail on that. But then I came to this idea because I wondered why children get depressed. And then I realized, well, it has to be from a feeling of loss. But you can't have a feeling of loss unless you've had some sort of previous experience which you've lost. And so I came to the understanding that children are born with this optimism,
mm,
this
mm,
sense that they know what they require, and not only that, they communicate it extremely forcefully. And they've got two main channels. One is screaming and crying, and the
mm,
other is gurgling and smiling.
mm,
And
mm,
they are just trying to manipulate you to be the archetype that you're meant to be.
mm,
But all parents fall short.
mm.
And
I
then
suppose that's for
as they
what.
fall short, all babies, I think, are, particularly if your parents fall short, have a tendency towards a sense of loss and depression.
Mm,
And then you're
yeah,
talking about you've got to try and recover that sense that it is possible to reconnect with that feeling of being nurtured, of being accepted, of being welcomed into the world because it's inside you.
I agree. And Claudio Naranjo, in his book Character and Neurosis, he wonderfully he kind of joins Buddhist psychology with developmental psychology, but he talks about that loss that grief. He calls it a loss of being, and that children are born with a sense of being, life-seeking being,
Mhm.
and that when they when there's the in the space between what could they have a potential to open out to and grow through, and what they get, they then collapse into a kind of a loss of being, what he calls looking for things in places it can't be found. And so they start to develop a characterological pattern that they think will be a substitute and give them a way, a survival way. But it also is like a holding pattern.
It's the best that a child can do, given
Mm,
what they've got. Given
mm,
their constitution, their neurological potential, and
mm,
given the environment and that relationship between those two. I always think the child does the best they can. Of course, if they've got a unfavorable environment and an unfavorable neurological inner environment, they're in trouble.
yeah.
Yeah.
They're pretty remarkable when you think about
Mhm.
the survival impetus in spite of what they don't get, how they then still use a lot of that vitality to find a way, wiggle their way forward. You've done a good job at that yourself.
Well, what about yourself? Have you done a good job?
I've done a pretty good job of wiggling my way forward through all of that, through all of those complications and awful feelings about myself as a child. And it's great to kind of find allies along the way.
Right.
And
Yeah. We talked a bit about that, about finding these special people. And
mm,
in some sense, you could say psychotherapy is this artificial situation in which we are standing in for the allies that they should have had, and that there should be more allies.
mm,
Um, but you've probably come across this. You'll find
mm,
somebody who's really suffering, but they will have had maybe a grandparent, or they'll have
mm,
had a teacher, or they'll have
mm,
had something. And that's almost like a little spark of hope, which they
mm,
can't nurture too much because then it might lead to disappointment. But you, as a therapist, can kind of blow on it, if you like, and it
mm, mm,
start to have a little bit more power.
mm, mm,
But then there's also, I'm thinking of some clients and they didn't seem to have anybody ever.
mm,
And
mm.
that's really tough.
It is really tough, but I also love the way that people um, like substitute, like through television or identification or even, habitual patterns, self-soothing. They're all holding patterns, still waiting for something that's real relationship to kind of come their way and to open out into those, like from those holding patterns into more, the possibility of more. And that sadly, very sadly, you know, there's something not available within a lot of our communities.
But that can be the spur for addiction, can't it?
Yeah,
Because
but
I've
it's still
found
still a holding pattern,
it's yeah,
right?
there's hope in it, but it gets to be a closed system. It tends
Mm,
when we're talking about stuckness, that's kind of the way I think of it. And now in this day and age where there's so much entertainment, so much distraction,
mm.
you could say endless. Um, and then it's like, so what's going to happen with that? It means that people are always going to be looking for relationship in that cell phone. And you've seen it. You've seen couples, I love it where you see the couples and they're sitting, they got their night out and they both got their cell phones. And it's like, what are they texting each other across the table? What's going on here?
They're looking for something in places it can't be found.
That's exactly what it's like. It's like,
Uh,
all right. I was just trying to think, what is this about? I'm not even sure what it's about.
okay, I'll try. Well, in terms of what is it about, I think it's about the importance of relationship and a particular kind of delight in coming into relationship and welcoming people into relationship. And even in terms of how one manages a session and ends a session, like me suggesting this, that we take a turn, it links a little bit with how to kind of create a containment field for how much more there is that needs to be explored week after week, and how much bigger a need is actually in all of us that could do with more of this kind of space. And so the turn taking feels a little bit like pulling the threads, as Winnicott said, pulling the threads together and holding them in a way that's got a kind of a creative stasis. It's not a dead wood stasis. It's more like there's a lot going on there in the magic ball, and waiting for the next opening, for that to crack open. And yeah, so I'm left with appreciation. I'm also left with the fact that we're human. We both have had, our struggles in our lives, and we've wiggled our way forwards. And it's so enjoyable um, to reflect on that openly, without shame and without uh, competition, and just to enjoy the flourishing that can go on with that kind of opportunity to share. So thank you very much.
The piece that I've learned from what this discussion is the sense of this space of potential between people. Last time we talked about resonance, and we also talked about kind of optimal distance. Maybe that didn't get into the video, I can't remember, but the optimal distance is like this space of potential between people, which if there isn't any if there isn't any hidden agenda, if there isn't any need for it to be a certain way, almost the unconscious of both people fill that space, and it kind of bubbles up with all sorts of interesting ideas. And I see you, John, you're great at somehow picking a book off your bookshelf, and flicking it open. Oh, yeah, there's Kubi. I remember Kubi, and he says this, you know, and that happens because of the space. It makes it easier to find things in our internal bookshelf, if you like, because
Mhm.
there's this space. So that bit, and I do like the delight. I have to say, I really enjoy psychotherapy. I really enjoy my clients. Sometimes they're stuck, and so I don't feel comfortable. Um, but I like the sense of potential of something possible is going to happen. Doesn't always happen. I like to leave people laughing. I believe that that's a piece of the delight, if you like, that the person should leave a session somehow lighter. And I don't think that's true for every therapist.
Mm.
For me, I like to laugh. I believe that laughter is really so profoundly healing. And I like to leave the space filled with all of this delight, if you like, when I finish a session. Are you funny?
I think I'm more strange than I am funny. I've and I think I don't have uh, as much of a sense of humor as you do, but I have a kind of sense of joy and enjoyment that
Yes, yeah.
it is like there is laughter, but it's not always laughter. It's sometimes just real joyful appreciation and a mutuality in that.
Yeah, and I mean, we could go on this discussion, but our delight, our joy, our enjoyment of the session, our joy of being alive, to me, that is a subtle influence on our clients. Sometimes more than a subtle influence. And we could go into a whole nother discussion, which I love the discussion.